French, and Latin to continue growing in the practice. The practice required sacrifice, patience, study, and going out on the limb emotionally and even physically at times. Because the commitment to poetry solidified my commitment to standing with humanity and justice, with the truth as best as I could discern it. The practice strengthened my will to nurture my imagination, not as an instrument of fantasy, but of insight, a seeing force, one that enabled my participation in creative endeavors more consequential than my own poetry and other writings. So, and all of that required an enormous amount of within myself to write that took an enormous amount of translating what was my normal habits of thought into, again, listening and understanding what I was hearing within myself. So, what do we mean by community of one? The point here is that as a poet, as a person, we are communities within ourselves. We have all these influences. We're composed of influences, familial, of course, what we learn in school, what we learn from our friends, what we hear, often unfiltered. We filter it later. And most of all, the society around us forms us. We know this. But in such a way that ideas that people had 150 years ago, decent, good people who had 150 years ago, now seem absolutely absurd. I don't even probably have to name them. But this is an ongoing process. And it's best as a writer, I believe, and as a poet, and as a translator, to have that perspective and to examine all of that. And that's how I started out. I didn't do it by choice. It just happened. If I was going to write the poetry, I had to do that. So we collocate within ourselves, consciously and otherwise, the voices of others. We talk about our singular voice. Our singular voice, as we'll talk about a little bit later, is composed of many, many voices. We grow and change as we discover and map connection and belonging. That was, again, as we heard in the preface, as I became a poet, and that's actually being very generous with those first poems, I've got to say. But as I became a poet, community took on a sense, a strength, and I'll say a world I had no idea existed. I was that mad, lonely poet before I was a poet. When I became a poet and met others and had started to form a community of not only people, but again, thoughts, ideas, voices, observations, that loneliness went away. So I don't really, I know the iconic image is based on maybe a handful of poets throughout history, which is unfair. We develop our values and obligations and are mindful of fulfilling them. Every poet I know personally, and I can only think of two exceptions historically in what I call modern history to this. This is why poets and writers, novelists, most nonfiction writers, have a rather deep sense of humanity. It's because they've done that work. They couldn't do their writing unless they did that inner work. Absolutely essential. And it's not easy. And sometimes it happens all on its own, and the more you write, the more it happens all on its own. It's a matter of allowing it to happen, allowing that truth to seep in. We set sail every day in our work, our inner ear tuned to discovery. And that's what I'm talking about. Every day that I write, I discover something. Sometimes I can name it, sometimes I can't. Sometimes it's a change of attitude. Sometimes it's something I'll have to mull on for years in order to truly understand it. But again, that listening. So the more influence that I feel, the more influence I experience, the richer I become. Even if that influence is negative and we process it. Right? Also, in your handouts, what I'll do with some of these slides is read a poem that kind of makes my point after each slide. This is one of my favorite poets ever, who passed away relatively recently, W.S. Merwin. Poem Utterance. Sitting over words, very late, I have heard a kind of whispered sighing, not far, like a night wind in pines, or like the sea in the dark, the echo of everything that has ever been spoken, still spinning its one syllable between the earth and silence. I guess I could have said all that I said or just read the poem. What I've been referring to, my beginnings as a poet translator. I've also done a lot of historical fiction based in China. You won't find that up there, it's not published. What's that about? It's 15 years writing a historical novel. At any rate, going back to age late 18, I was at UC Santa Barbara. I was studying economics, and but there was this huge influence of poetry throughout the dorm. I was in a dorm, and outside of that dorm. That was because of the Vietnam War. I went to college toward the end of the Vietnam War, and people were turning to poetry. Young folks were turning to poetry like crazy. Leonard Cohen's poetry, Richard Brautigan's poetry, that spoke to young folks, but people were reading almost everything. So the very first poem I wrote, and I use those air quotes because it is what it is, but I just felt overcome by memory, idea, and emotion. And I had left my family, to go to school, and I wrote this poem called The Butterfly for my sister, because I missed her very much, my younger sister. And I literally thought those 4 hours were 1/2 hour. I was so overcome, so possessed, and I just felt like an instrument. That feeling has continued throughout. I don't feel like I write the poems. I don't know who writes the poems. I'm just the vehicle. It's how it feels when I'm writing. And that feeling of being a conduit more than a creator has lasted, thankfully. I needed to discover what I was, am, will be. That was absolutely essential. We had a lot on the line. And General Westmoreland was lying through his teeth to Congress, and people were dying absolutely unnecessarily, and continued to die unnecessarily because of those lies. And that's well understood today. There's no controversy about that unless you're into that. So here I am studying economics. I go into the bookstore. I got bit by the poetry bug, and I just picked up a book called Collected Shorter Poems by Kenneth Rexroth. Now, Kenneth Rexroth is one of the great American poets of the 20th century. And he's an icon, a giant. He was also associated with the Beats in San Francisco. He was their granddaddy. He's not a beat poet, but he sure did foster those folks. Folks like Gary Snyder, our neighbor up on North San Juan Ridge. And I started reading the shorter poems, was utterly taken. I had no idea he was teaching at UC Santa Barbara. No idea. I picked up Pablo Neruda. Well, and then I gave him 30 years of my life. Denise Levertov, Merwin, this community of poets started to form within me. Their voices were absolutely essential, but more than their voices in a couple of cases. So I read, I studied, indulged my curiosity, and found a community of poets, people, friends. And when I did that, it was incredible how that, I'll call it a web, spread. Suddenly, this fairly lonely guy in the dorm, goofing off and all that stuff, suddenly had not only this network of individuals who were all creating and trying to find out who they were. Most of them were young students. But also all of these voices, that support. There wasn't a lot of backsnapping or any of that. It wasn't like, I'm better than you. It was probably the most support I have felt in any kind of community in my life. So, Sam Hamill, I don't know if you know that name. He's also an iconic poet. Met him, he was 8, 9 years older. I don't know what he saw in me, but he was light years ahead of me in poetry, but he was studying at UC Santa Barbara on the GI Bill. He and I became fast best friends. We read poetry together to each other Friday, Saturday nights, at his place mostly, talked about the world, sat in silence, listened to music, all of that. Jim Gottney, a mutual friend, Tree Swenson. The four of us picked up enough, accumulated enough energy, and certain things happened at UCSB that were kind of a bit of a betrayal of us. We edited a magazine, Sam and I, the journal Spectrum, and we won Best College Magazine in the Nation Award from the Coordinating Council of Literary Magazines, and the English department tried to take the money that was intended for Sam. And he was on a GI Bill, living on a shoestring. And so in my senior year, fall of my senior year, I'm just about getting through, I, Sam, Jim, and Tree left Santa Barbara, I dropped out of school. Jim was the only one who wasn't going to school. And we headed to Denver to start a poetry publishing press. My parents were thrilled. But oddly supportive in that they didn't, act out on me, which really surprised me. And I'll speak more about that later, but let me read you a Denise Levertov poem. And all of this required incredible amount of attention, intention, work, It was really, really difficult, and I was so thankful for it once it was over, that founding, and living on an absolute shoestring and going to the typographer's equipment and a supply and buying typefaces. We actually did put out books on a letterpress at first. It's incredible. That's a whole other subject that's really worth delving into. We probably won't get to it today, especially at my current rate. Witness by Denise Levertov. Sometimes the mountain is hidden from me in veils of cloud. Sometimes I am hidden from the mountain in veils of inattention, apathy, fatigue. When I forget or refuse to go down to the shore or a few yards up the road on a clear day to reconfirm that witnessing presence. We all tried to escape our intention, but it didn't work, thankfully, in terms of founding Copper Canyon. So all these elements, I tried to list the elements of poetry. Every time I do it, the list changes. What's considered an element. But alliteration, diction and tone, imagery, metaphor, syntax and meter, persona, and so many poets forget about that. They think, I'm just being myself, I'm being real, and that vertical pronoun, I, that's me. No. Every time you go to write a poem, you take on a voice. And it's not exactly you. It's not exactly me, that I know. And it's good to remember that because it gives you all this latitude. But I see so often that being an absolute absence in many of the poems, even a poem a day, Academy of American Poets. You could do better. You could do better if you gave yourself that room. Simile, this like that, right? Structure and form, symbolism, theme, all of that collocates. It all comes together in a certain constellated way to form the voice. So the voice isn't what you're hearing now so much as what's behind what you're hearing now. That's the voice. And the voice gives the poem authenticity, or not. Thus the need for all that truth-seeking that I was referring to earlier. Without that, the poem will not, people will not feel its authenticity, will not have that authenticity. It'll be what we call contrived. So, in my junior year, after studying with Frederick Turner, a poet, UC Santa Barbara, and he was the son of the great British anthropologist, Frederick Turner. He was a trip. He was wonderful. I was invited by Kenneth Rexroth, who was only a lecturer at UCSB because he didn't have a degree. Kenneth Rexroth did not have a college degree. He had outpublished everybody on the faculty. And well, he also was one of the great translators of the 20th century in poetry. And he had this belief, and this is labeled dumb luck because I had no idea. Right? So, and he taught class, a seminar called World Poetry, limited topic, at his cottage in Montecito, where he lived with Carol Tinker, his wife. So he invited Sam Hamill, myself, and 8, 9, 10 other poets, young poets, to come to study with him in his World Poetry Seminar. And we're headed that way, and I'm just terrified. Sam's driving, picked me up, he's driving, and I'm just terrified. I don't know, Sam, maybe we ought to go get dinner or something. Sam looks at me like, you fool, we're going. And this is how much I'd come to revere Rexroth. And the reason is because reading his poetry did create for me what I would call, and I don't mean this in strictly religious terms, a sacramental relationship. There was a rite of passage involved, but also the way in which he looked at the world so hugely. His perspective is enormous, and yet his poetry is precise, emotionally precise, full of love, even when it's invective, political, whatever. And he would sit there in his big chair, we'd be all sitting on the floor, and he'd start reciting poetry from Colombia, and then he'd recite poetry from France, and then he'd recite poetry from England, and then China. If you really want a tip, Kenneth Rexroth, 100 Poems from the Japanese, 100 Poems from the Chinese. Get these books, they're freaking incredible. Anyway, this excerpt that you see up here is from his a letter to William Carlos Williams, a name probably most of you are familiar with, the great William Carlos Williams, pediatrician and incredibly influential poet. And it's just a tribute to Williams and what he did for the Imagist movement, but also what he did for people who find poetry confusing, aloof, playing simple terms that open up a world within oneself. And this is the end of that poem. And the beautiful river he saw still flows in his veins, as it does in ours, and flows in our eyes, and flows in time, and makes us part of it, and part of him. That, children, is what is called a sacramental relationship. And that is what a poet is, children, one who creates sacramental relationships that last always. Those are my favorite lines ever, I think, because it's proven so true in my life. And again, going back to how I prefaced this talk, this presentation, that has fueled me throughout all the decades. Dumb luck, too. was having Hugh Kenner, the great modernist critic, also be teaching in the English department there. I switched my major at the end of my first year from economics, which really wasn't suiting me. That D in statistics didn't speak well for me at all. I just lost all interest, but I was interested in macro and micro. But anyway, and so because I was studying with Kenner, we studied Ezra Pound, and so did Sam and I. We spent a lot of time studying Pound, and Pound had translated pieces of Confucius, as we know him. And this again is utterly cornerstone influential to my life as a poet, but as a human being. This is from the Great Learning, the Dashio, of Confucius. The Great Learning, adult study, grinding the corn in the head's mortar to fit it for use, takes root in clarifying the way wherein the intelligence increases through the process of looking straight into one's own heart and acting on the results. It is rooted in watching with affection the way people grow. It is rooted in coming to rest, being at ease in perfect equity. If the root be in confusion, nothing will be well referring back to what I discovered with that community of fellow student poets and community poets about the same age, sometimes quite a bit older, that watching with affection the way people grow. The affection and the way people grow is really, really important, but the grow is absolutely, in my life, absolutely essential to maintaining any sense of longevity with my work. So I did everything I could to grow, even stuff that sometimes, as you all know as well, scares us. And the Dashio that this is from also makes the point that if you're going to establish a well-founded nation, well, you have to also establish that within yourself. That community of one, that community of self. But if you can't, raise a family in a balanced way, you also probably can't lead a nation. And you can't lead a family, care for a family well, unless you know yourself well. And you can't know yourself well. This is actually spiraling in and spirals out in the Dashio. You can't know yourself well unless you're honest with yourself. As honest as you can possibly be, even when it scares you. And how are you going to be honest with yourself? Well, listen to the tones given off by the heart. Like that chord again. And how do you do that? How do you interpret that? How do you translate that for yourself? Using words precisely. That's Confucius. That's not me. I mean, I've adopted that. That was in the Dashio as well. No wonder, Ezra Pound was so taken with Confucius, and so many poets have been since. Dumb Luck 3, the experience of becoming. I mean, I can't. My good fortune early on, I still, for me, is breathtaking. And this is a quote probably many of you are familiar with from E.E. Cummings, his advice, a poet's advice to students. To be nobody but yourself in a world which is doing its best night and day to make you everybody else means to fight the hardest battle any human being can fight and never stop fighting. Amen. I'm just going to let that sit. This poem is called I Am From, and it's written by Daniela. We don't have a last name here because she's a third grader, or was a third grader, when she wrote this at Manchester Avenue Elementary in LA. I am from. I am from Mexico. I am from Guanajuato. I am from my home. I am from chicken. I am from pizza. I am from strawberry cake. I am from white rice. I am from limpia tu cuarto, clean your room. I am from no vayas, don't go. I am from métate, get in. I am from ve a la tienda, go to the store. I am from mom and dad. I am from Misha. I am from Mrs. Lisa. I am from my friends. Third grade. She was so far ahead of me. It's like light years, that understanding of community. This was produced through the California Poets in the Schools program. So, Let's check something here. I think I hit this. Okay, good. So, now let's keep this up here. I'm a huge Flannery O'Connor fan because of one thing in particular. She's a great writer, we know that. But how she impressed me most is talking about the people in her community which she loved in a way that was so honest, including the strains of hypocrisy in her community, and still loving that community. So I read almost everything she wrote. Truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it. Truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it. In other words, right? If we don't like what we hear, if we don't like the truth, we change it, well, that's when we break, that's when we betray ourselves. And this is very common, unfortunately. When I read this, it spurred the very first poem that I ever really considered a poem. The others, The Butterfly I mentioned for my sister, it's a sweet poem, but no one's going to publish it, and they'd be crazy if they did. But it was sincere. The Kalahari Bushman, the idea came to me through Lauren Isley's book, The Immense Journey, which influenced me incredibly. And Rex Roth, I hitchhiked to his house, to his cottage one Saturday, and we were just talking, and he said, "Where in the hell did you get that idea?" Lauren Isley, and he hadn't read Lauren Isley. I think that's the only book Rex Roth never read. I mean, I was blown away. And he absolutely loved the poem for its honesty. I don't know about anything else, but its honesty. This was published in Spectrum by Sam Hamill, which blew my mind. First poem, published. Then a bunch of others weren't, subsequently. Oh, everything I write will be published. No, for good reason. The Kalahari Bushman. A glance. Your graceful neck stretched past wings. Greasy feathers set in black. Body rises through the rain and curling as smoke escapes fire. Black clown, come back. My eyes follow your pattern, moving towards death. An African convict laughs at miners, lion tamers, sunk into Pyronia deeply, as rain clouds stalk them by night. The desert cold clinging to their flesh, their mine shafts that yield heat, steam seeping, scalding our retinas' never-failing eyesight, thickens, always to see you, me, you mock me, in yourself. Inside them, I feel you. All my life I have thrown you at windows, only missing by a fraction. I improve with time. I shout your name, its echo spirals on inside me. Mirrors shatter, I no longer see your cage, only the smoke rising from its body. Its lock broken, the skeleton melting inside from where you escape, black, laughing as you rise, feathers fall into the mud, one by one bones crack as muscles freeze, your brain is lost, cold without me, it stops. You are free, laughing at me, yourself flying away from, you are dead. And now this day I stand silent, the strange warmth of mud slipping between my toes, my waist bending slowly as I pick pieces of bone gleaming from the muck. I examine them, their odd broken cells reviewing the crudity of past. Myself a bushman, whose knowledge depends solely on bones, imprints of feathers, Piltdown, and echoes growing weaker within me. Piltdown was a huge hoax, by the way. Late at night, with the last breath of campfire, I squat, the glint of red-hot coals scalding my eyes for traces of proof. Tiny steaming skulls, warned by and forever caked in my memory, a sensitivity to mud. I should have mentioned Piltdown before I started reading, if you aren't familiar with it, but it was supposed to be what was kind of ridiculously called the missing link back in the early 1900s, in the 1910s, and was discovered as a hoax, I believe, in the mid-50s. So at any rate, I still have found the missing link. But anyway, I became fixated on process, as that poem might suggest, and that was a good thing as well. So I also started editing. I was editing with Sam, Spectrum Magazine, and we went on to found Copper Canyon Press. And this was huge, not only for my own writing, but for that. The tensions of American life, as well as the possibilities, are tremendous, is certainly not even a question. But these are dealt with in contemporary literature, mainly compulsively. That is, the book is more likely to be a symptom of our tension than an examination of it. And this was written at a time where there was a lot of, and this, Baldwin, in Nobody Knows My Name, More Notes of a Native Son, you read this in context, you realize he's not condemning all American writers. You read it in context, and you realize that what he's talking about is that writers who imitate. It's good to do imitation as an exercise, but who were imitative of others and who stayed on the surface. And I see a lot of this. I mean, if you go to edit a literary journal that has any profile at all, and you get 1,000 submissions a week, you see it. You see it. It's folks largely comprised in poetry. It's a little bit different in fiction, believe it or not, who don't read a lot because they want to maintain their singularity, their own voice. And that's the biggest mistake you can possibly make. And I see so much of it now, so much of it. Trends. Well, if I write like that person, I'll get awards too. We're obsessed with awards. I mean, it's driving me crazy. The American literary world is obsessed with awards, honors. And it's not doing us any good at all. Though there is also, as James Baldwin would honor, a great deal of good work going as well. But there's so much of it now. MFA programs everywhere. There must be one down the street. And they tend to foster this. So finding your singularity now, your own voice now, requires what it's always required, but you're also working against quite a tide. So what all this gets to, in my mind, is the word empathy. And empathy, of course, isn't sympathy. The word empathy was created in German, Einfühlung. I believe. Please forgive me if you speak German. I did my best. In the 1880s, it's a brand new word as words go. And it was brought into the English language as empathy in the early 1900s. And what it is very well described by Barack Obama in Istanbul in 2009. Learning to stand in somebody else's shoes, to see through their eyes, that's how peace begins. And it's up to you to make that happen. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world because it changes the individual. It's really about, and when it was created in German, what it is used for mainly was, you go through a gallery looking at art on the wall, and you see figures, human figures, for instance, and being able to recognize those emotions in that figure or figures within the painting, and identify with those emotions in order to understand them, not necessarily take them on. That's how it's different from sympathy in some ways. Empathy never meant taking on people's emotions. It meant understanding them. It means understanding them. And as Susan Sarandon says, when you start to develop your powers of empathy and imagination, the whole world opens up to you. Amen. Once again. And again about voice, Roberta Flack, one of my favorites, in an article called "Roberta's a Capital Find" in the New York Times, 1970, she was quoted as saying, "I've been told I sound like Nina Simone, Nancy Wilson, Odetta, Barbra Streisand, Dionne Warwick, even Mahalia Jackson. If everybody said I sounded like one person, I'd worry. But when they say I sound like them all, I know I've got my own style." Thank you, Roberta, for your music as well as for that. I felt like, oh, I do understand this. I do understand this. And what this all gets to in my mind, and what I'm trying to convince you guys of, is that community composes the community of self. Larger community composes the community of self. As Edmund White, the great Edmund White, who passed away in June of 2025, novelist, memoirist, playwright, biographer, essayist, incredible individual. As he says, your deepest sense of duty and obligation as a writer is to history and to the people you knew and loved. That's it. That's it. That's proven. That has opened doors opened doors for me in terms of my work greatly. And it's anchored me. But it's also why poets tend to be humanists. And it's also why in fascist or authoritarian regimes, poets are one of the first they come for. We've seen that since about Du Fu's time, about Confucius's time. And I'd like to read, and Pablo Neruda, well, one thing that attracted me to him, he was the voice of the Chilean people. He spoke for the miners who made 50 cents an hour, 12 hours a day, 100, 200 feet under the earth. He was invested with that. He didn't take it on. He didn't adopt it. He didn't say, I am this person. He was given that. He was a senator from the mining district early on in his life. And he'd give a speech, political speech, which he never really enjoyed doing. He was a poet. And he did this out of obligation, out of duty. He ran for senator. Being requested to run for senator, he won. And after he'd give these speeches, the miners who were largely illiterate, they could not read, would start to shout, "Poema! Poema!" And he was so used to this, he'd pull a book out of his pocket and read them a poem. I'd like to read you Neighborhood Without Light. This is excerpted from the Book of Twilight, which my most recent translation of Neruda. It was his first book. He was 19 years old when the book was published. He was about 17, 18 when he wrote this poem. He came from Temuco, a backwater in those days. Now it's sort of a business center. A backwater in those days, very rural, and he was very much attached to his community. And when he moved to Santiago, and in those days Santiago was kind of a disaster, and there was, again, an authoritarian government in charge. Neighborhood Without Light. Does poetry depart from things, or is my life not able to distill it? Yesterday, watching the last of twilight, I was a patch of moss among some ruins. The cities, soot and vengeance, the gray filth of the suburbs, the office that bends backs, the boss with roiled eyes. Blood of a red glow over the hills, blood in the streets and the plazas, ache of broken hearts, rot of disgust and of tears. A river embraces the outskirts of the city like a frozen hand that feels its way in the darkness. Above its waters, the stars are ashamed to be seen. And the houses that hide desires behind lit windows, while outside the wind brings a little mud to each rose. Far away, the mist of forgetfulness, thick smoke, broken edge of dikes, and the country, the green country, in which pant the oxen and the sweating men. And here I am, sprouted among the ruins, alone, chewing on all the sadness, as if the weeping were a seed, and I the only furrow on the earth. 18 years old, at best. One of my favorite visual artists, especially when I lived up in Seattle, before I came down here, was Jean Quick-to-See Smith. She's a Confederated Salish, was. She also died very recently. And I loved her paintings. Her work was amazing. The use of color was one of the most extraordinary palettes I had ever seen. And I was reading her obituary, and again in 2025, and the same quote that I had seen years before a couple years before in Vulture, which is New York's entertainment magazine. This quote just said it for me. When I come through the door, I bring a community with me. I want there to be others after me. I am not one. I am one among many. My community comes with me. Let that sit. And read another Neruda poem, if I may. This is decades and decades after the first one that I just read from his first book. This is from Winter Garden, one of the late and posthumous books that I published. It's back there. Second edition of the book came out in 2002. And this poem gets cited a lot. And this is where Neruda talks about his obligations. I'm going to quote a little bit earlier. We're formed by our loves and our obligations. For all to know. Someone will ask later, sometimes searching for a name, his own or someone else's. Why I neglected his sadness or his love, or his reason, or his delirium, or his hardships. And he'll be right. It was my duty to name you, someone far away and someone close by, to name someone for his heroic scar, to name a woman for her petal, the arrogant one for his fierce innocence, the forgotten one for his famous obscurity. But I didn't have enough time or ink for everyone. Or maybe it was the strain of the city, of time, the cold heart of the clocks that beat interrupting my measure. Something happened. I didn't decipher it. I couldn't grasp each and every meaning. I asked forgiveness from anyone not here. It was my duty to understand everybody, becoming delirious, weak, unyielding, compromised, heroic, vile, loving until I wept, and sometimes an ingrate, a savior entangled in his own chains, all dressed in black, toasting to joy. Why describe your truths if I lived with them? I am everybody and every time. I always call myself by your name. So Sam, I keep mentioning Sam Hamill, goes to Greece and meets Odysseus Elitis, another one of my most favorite poets. I absolutely love this guy. He has passed away. And actually Sam at Copper Canyon, well after I left the press, published Olga Brumus's translations of Elitis. It's actually Elitis is how it's pronounced. And he's this, think about how many books we sell in this country. After Elitis would publish a book in Greece, his home country, 25,000 copies would sell in the first week. Yeah, people close to their poetic culture. And part of that also, he's a Nobel Prize winner. He is an incredible poet and loved by the youth of Greece. There were many of those 25,000 purchases. So Sam's sitting with Odysseus in Odysseus' living room, and they're talking, and Sam asked him something like, how do you relate to your audiences? And here this Nobel Prize winning poet sitting there, he looks up at the ceiling and looks back at Sam and says, well, every writer has at least 2 intelligent friends. I am always searching for the third. And here, intelligent, Sam did have it in Greece. I looked it up. Prosektikos. It's not really intelligent so much. That's how Sam interpreted it. It's really closer to attentive or aware. And in certain contexts, careful. And that's not too bad either. But at any rate, that, ever since I've heard that 25 years ago, it's formed my sense of audience as well. But it's a really good way of speaking about community. You're always building out. I'm always looking for that third friend after he sells 25,000 books in the first week. Yeah, that humility. It's stunning to me. So now we're getting into the translation. We'll finish with that. I have a couple more slides. With all that influence and all those relationships and correspondences and convergences that we've been speaking about, the royal we here, again, we're always interpreting, always translating. And it's an absolute essential act that we do almost continuously throughout the day, every day. One of the great books on translation is George Steiner's After Babel, Aspects of Language and Translation. And as I about my third or fourth Neruda book, I picked up Steiner's After Babel. It's like that. And I just absolutely loved every word of it. But this I found both very wise and a bit hilarious. Before the fall, man and woman may have spoken the same tongue, comprehending each other's meaning perfectly. Immediately after, speech divided them. And I had also been reading Deborah Tanner, who spent years studying men's and women's speech and the correspondences between them. And I was teaching her at that time. And George is right on. What it was is that women process more verbally. It's just the way women are built. Men are built more, a little more, I'll be generous and say succinct. Reticent, withholding. But at any rate, that kind of makes my point. That's why I'm bringing it to your attention. I just couldn't, I couldn't resist not including it. So I'm studying with Rexroth, and this is a paraphrase because what he said was, well, I couldn't memorize it all. When we translate, we live within the work of a poet who has earned our trust, captured our hearts and minds, and posed essential questions we continue to answer every day. As a result, our own work gains greater clarity, authenticity of voice. Remember what I was saying when we started off here. Breadth, depth, and longevity. We provide a service to our own culture as well. And off I went. Immediately went to the bookstore again, picked up Residencia en la Tierra, Residence on Earth, Neruda, opened it up, read it again 2 years after I had first discovered it. And the translation, I'm part Mexican, my grandmother on my father's side, mostly Irish, some Mexican, and I had heard Spanish spoken. I studied it for 6 years in school, but heard it spoken by my dad, mainly on LA freeways. His vocabulary, Neruda's vocabulary, very different. Different situations, calls for different measures, cadences. But at any rate, the translator, Donald Walsh, is very accurate and very flat. And Neruda in the original is gorgeous. Spanish is language of poetry in my mind. But no one has a better ear in the Spanish language than Pablo Neruda had. Years later, well, maybe 8 years later, I'm back in California, having founded the press, and I decide I'm living in Modesto, and I want to get my BA finally, and I wanted to study with Philip Levine, Pulitzer Prize winner down there in Fresno, and because I loved his work. His work was fueling me at that time, had fueled me for a few years. And one day he walks in, he's not known as a translator, but he did translate Jaime Sabines of Mexico, Gloria Fuertes of Mexico, and did a very nice job. And he was doing Fuertes at this time. So we're in a poetry workshop 1996. That's a typo. 1976, I'll change that. And wishful thinking, I think. So, and he goes, it's like the second or third session, and he looks around, his class, no one said a word, no one sang a word. He looks around at the class and says, "You young poets, you're so full of yourselves. Next workshop, don't bring your own poem. Bring a translation of a poet you love. If you don't speak another language, get a dictionary." In other words, do the best you can. And so I went out. I went to the Stanislaus County Library in Modesto and was looking through the Spanish language section, and there was all the Neruda, and I knew nearly all of it. I read it in translation, not in the original. And then there's this one book called Aún. Well, that means still or and yet, just on a literal level without context. So I take it home, translate the first poem. Oh God, it was hard. And brought it to class. Levine said, "Oh yeah, you did a nice job, a very nice job. You got the music." Yes. Yeah. Donald Walsh, take that. See, we are a little vindictive. Let's forget about that. So, at any rate, I got home. I was feeling really good, and well, I can go just translate the rest of the book. That's how the 9-book series started. Thank you to Philip Levine. So, during that time, and then I updated the editions in the early 2000s, then did 2 more books. I always thought I was through. Neruda wouldn't let go. So it ended up being 9 books. Went around after doing the late and posthumous, 8 of the late and posthumous books, went around, did the first book, which I read the poem from you, Neighborhood Without Light. And now I'm done. He comes knocking on my door, I don't answer it. I don't. So here is my take on what makes a successful translation. And what translation has done, I'll preface this, what translation has done for my life, just as a person, who I've met, where I've gone, what I've been shown, I can't distill it. I can't distill it. It's still out there carrying me along. It opened up a world I'd say my own poetry never got close to. And I've been well published, I have no complaints. That's a whole other story. I don't know what time it is. 11:13. Yeah, okay. We're doing okay? Yeah. Okay, good. And because I was translating Neruda, this is a story worth telling, because the Chilean people are incredible. They were to me anyway, and many of them. I couldn't go to Chile when I wanted to. Chilean poet and playwright Marco Antonio de la Parra came and visited when I lived in Seattle. Sergio Mancia Torres lived with me for a little while. He was going to University of Washington. And they were absolutely wonderful. And we sat there one day, all of us, when we were all there together. Everyone was in the States. And we talked a lot about Chile and what was happening there. This is during the Augusto Pinochet dictatorship. And I knew what was going on, but they were losing relatives, being killed, and all of that. And after we talked for an hour and a half, Marco Antonio looks at Sergio and says, "He's ready." And I said, "I'm ready." So he's trying to and yes, he's ready to go to Chile. And I was blown away by that, but I could not go. Because as a Neruda translator, even then, there was 4 books were published, 5 books. As a Neruda translator, anywhere I went, anyone I visited would be in trouble. This is an authoritarian regime. This is a dictatorship. They poisoned Neruda. That's how he died. They discovered that a year and a half ago, after testing 2 times before. He was in the Santa Maria clinic. He had prostate cancer, but that's not what killed him. And his chauffeur, the guy never drove a mile in his life. He was always driven somewhere. Kept telling current authorities over the years, he was poisoned. He was poisoned. Sure enough, they found the protein that proved it, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And when he was in the clinic getting treated for cancer, a doctor came in, gave him a doctor no one recognized. He hadn't seen him before, and he'd been there a couple of weeks. And gave him a shot in the abdomen, didn't tell him what it was for. You need this now. Left, and that no one ever saw that doctor again. This is not a conspiracy theory in any way, shape, or form. It was very likely a CIA agent. Because he was not, Chileans knew he was not Chilean. So, and it was what brought this on, who essentially helped install Augusto Pinochet in power, was Henry Kissinger and Nixon. But Kissinger was the mover and shaker. Tens of thousands of people died, were tortured and died. So I couldn't go. There was an election in 1990. Finally, this was 73 when the coup happened. Finally, there was an election, and of course Pinochet lost, and that was the end of the dictatorship. But I couldn't go because I had this really big job. I was working for Microsoft as a senior instructional designer for Windows. And 60-hour weeks don't comport well with travel, especially even going out of town sometimes is hard. So I waited, and then I waited a long time. I moved back to California. And when it came time to write the introduction to World's End, which is back there, it's the second truly full-length, book-length poem that Neruda wrote, the first one being Canto General, General Song. I said, I can't write this introduction without going to Chile. So I went, spent 3 weeks in Chile and a week on Easter Island. The second book that I translated of Neruda's La Rosa Separada, Separate Rose, takes place on the island, so I wanted to go there. And everywhere I went in Chile, and you'll be amazed this doesn't happen here, people said, "Oh, you're the Neruda translator." And I was treated like royalty, which made me a little uncomfortable, except they were so down-to-earth, lovely people. Everywhere I went, not only the poets and writers, but people, that it was hard to feel too uncomfortable. So I went to his 3 homes, Neruda's 3 homes, which are now all museums. I was a collector. Oh my God. It was unbelievable. And then before I left Santiago, people ushered me around to Neruda's spots, his favorite hangouts and where he liked to go. And then they took me to Via Grimaldi. Via Grimaldi used to be an artist's salon. South American artists, poets, writers from all over would come and meet there and have a salon. They'd come from, internationally, intercontinentally, from Europe. I don't know anyone from the States who went. I'm sure they did. Mexico, of course, Central America, would come and meet there. It was vibrant. And Pinochet hated it, just hated the idea. He was actually had a weird pathological fear of books. I'm not kidding, it's true. A friend of mine, a publisher from Seattle, actually saw him come into a bookstore one day. He didn't come in to look at books, he wouldn't look at books. He came in to talk to the clerk, just to make sure everything was in line. And he had an entourage, of course, bodyguards. Jim Bodine said it was one of the weirdest things he'd ever experienced. So, Via Grimaldi, what happened is that Pinochet turned that into his primary torture camp. That's how he got revenge for artists having such a wonderful time and sharing ideas. And I won't go into what I saw there, but they took me places they don't take the public. And that also was formative. I'm still forming. That was formative back in 2008. And so anyway, but what it did is tell me, okay, kid, what you've done all these years with these translations, you had no idea what you were contributing to. And the funniest thing, before I get into what we have here on the slide, is before I went to Easter Island, flew to Easter Island from Santiago, I had dinner with the person who was running the cabana on Easter Island. She wanted to meet me, I wanted to meet her. So we went out for dinner, she brought her boyfriend. And we had dinner, we had a nice time. He seemed a little odd to me, but she is wonderful. And so we're in this alley heading back to my hotel, or my actual apartment, really, Vieiros. And he finally addresses my Neruda work, and he goes, "Neruda, he was a communist." And I look at him, and now he had been decades before what I'd call a Pure Land communist. If you're ever you probably have not read Liu Shaoqi, the Chinese politician who was right under Mao. But he wrote the most beautiful, I don't know what to call it, the word's not coming to me, testament to communism. If it really worked like it did in his essay, oh God, we'd all want it. There'd be no reason not to. You'd bathe in it, but that's not how it turns out, right? Yeah. At any rate, though Neruda, I don't think he ever met Liu Shaoqi, that's what the communist Neruda was when he was in his 20s. Freaking paradise. And in reaction to there being almost no middle class in Chile in those days. Either very wealthy or you were impoverished. And so anyway, he goes, "Neruda, he's a communist." I say, "Bring back Pinochet." And I looked at him, and first words in my mind, "You're a guest in this country. You're a guest in this country. Keep it buttoned, kid. Keep it buttoned." I just looked at him, and he knew my work, or he knew of it. And he goes, "Yeah, Pinochet brought peace to this country." He's a brutal dictator who, some estimates go to killed 30 or 40,000 of his own people. Wow. Brought peace to this country. That's how deranged people can be around politics. Now, the stuff about, truth doesn't change with your ability to stomach it, forget it. But, so anyway, And then we're walking along and I'm boiling inside, and he goes, but I'm really grateful to Neruda. What he did for Chilean culture throughout the world. He spread it all over the world. I love that. Yeah. Where do you go to get treated for whiplash around here? It was like, but that's Chile. You know, even the far, far right wing are proud of their culture and indulge in their culture. I mean, it's across the spectrum. And that also taught me a lot. So that's how I would express a small part of the benefit to myself, but also the interchange of cultures. I helped with many other translators, some of whom did fantastic jobs, of bringing Neruda here. I have talked to people, and they, you know, I'll mention Merwin, I'll mention Levertov, you know, to someone. People who aren't poets, just, yeah, these are my favorite poets. They ask me what I do, you know, whatever the conversation is. They won't have any idea who these folks are. Not a clue. And, you know, I can understand that. But I'll go, yeah, and I translate Pablo Neruda. Oh, Neruda! I had him in my Spanish class, you know, read him in the Spanish. And, you know, I mean, that's happened so many times. We won't know a single American poet, not a single one. Maybe my brother or my sister, they like writing poetry. Cool, awesome. But they'll know Neruda. He translated into 48 languages, last time I checked. I think it's probably more now. But at any rate, that's what translation, not me. I mean, that's what I experienced. That's what translation does. And it's so absolutely what we do every single day, all day. A successful translation renders the elements, the convergences, the essence and spirit of the original poem as faithfully as possible. While all readers experience a poem in their own way, a successful translation carries across the experience inherent in the original, not merely its words. The translator recreates the sacramental relationships. Thank you, Kenneth. Those energies and interactions, the heart, the soul, the insightful truth embodied and living there. By doing so, the translator broadens and deepens our sense of community. I made that up, but it's true. It's true. What I was going to do is the preface and this were just going to be notes, and then they became what they became. Without, you know, me even, I think I'll rework that. You know, it just happened. You know, I just kept working on the notes, thinking, oh, that's interesting. That's not interesting. And at any rate, just like a poem gets written, just like relationships form among people. And so, at any rate, I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to present all of this material to you, because it coalesced so much for me. I feel selfish about that. I'm benefiting probably more than you guys by putting this together and presenting it to you. And first of all, before we go to the last slide, does anyone have any questions? I was worried about time, so I didn't invite a lot of questions, but now we have time. Yes.
It seems to me that a translation is more effective if the translator has empathy, as opposed to opposition or is kind of arguing as a thought. But it made me wonder how much of the translator's voice is in the translation?
That's an excellent question.
Question.
It's hard to discern because, assuming that the translator can read the original correctly in terms of sound and cadence. Cadence is fairly individual, but the poem will guide you that way if it's a really well-constructed poem. So it's really hard to tell, but that's a question, I must say, I ask myself almost every time I'd sit down and translate. Am I bringing across as much Neruda as I possibly can in this translation? And, I'll share that the Chilean poets I know who are friends said, yeah, you did a good job. But they're also very kind. So, but that's something that you always have to be aware of. And the other thing is, it's like acting. Robert Duvall says, you really, no matter what character you're playing in a movie or play, you have to stay within yourself. So a reaction has to be authentically yours in order to portray the character accurately, who's not you. And that's, I think, very endemic to the process of translation. All you have is your own voice, which constitutes many voices. So that the fact that your voice constitutes many voices enables you to at least hear and deliver, bring across, translate that sound, tone, again, cadence, and the level of language, the diction. You want it to be there, with the translation. All of that goes a long way. But English and Spanish sound very different.
Yeah.
Spanish, it's almost like you can't help it. You order dinner and, you've spoken a poem. It's such a beautiful language. It's so resonant, So I hope that goes a little way to answer your question.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to follow up on what she said, but on a technical point of view, because languages are so different. And I as an example, Stephen King would write a clause, and it's like, oh, okay. And then there'd be a comma, and the next clause would be, oh my God, and all the hair would stand up in the fear. And to do that technically in different languages, as a translator, I find that really, really fascinating and interesting and impressive if someone can translate, because writers use their own language in a technical way to get that fear and that sudden emotion, which may be the other language, because in Russian, for instance, the clauses are all different. And so they couldn't use the same technology to get that same feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So,
That's very, very true. And the only thing I would add is that it isn't just a technical process. If you don't feel it, if you can't read the original poem or story closely and feel it in the original, you probably won't bring it across in English. So, there's no real technical method there, but it is, the closest we can get to technical in that sense is learning to listen, learning how to work with yourself to allow those voices to come, that inner voice to come in an authentic way.
Sometimes I read a poem and I have to read it 3 or 4 times and I still don't understand what they're talking about. And I am wondering, are there any tips for somebody like me who doesn't always understand a poem? How do you understand what the poet is saying?
Well, I don't think you're alone. I had the same experience. Had the same experience yesterday with a poem.
Uh-huh.
But poems, if there's enough there to draw your attention a second time, or second read, third read, or like Rex Roth's poem, Letter to William Carlos Williams with Sacramental Relationships That Last Always. I mean, I've read that poem, I don't know, 1,000 times, I mean, easily. And every time I read it, I learn more. So it isn't just a process of picking up a poem and reading it. And in fact, poems I've picked up and I feel that I've pretty much got everything there, I never pick up again. So another way I'd say it is, what you do with a poem, what I do with a poem, this is my metaphor, is dance with it. You move with it. You just allow it to speak to you. Rather than attacking it with your mind, which I do all the time, and then so, wait a minute. You dance with it, you listen to it, you let it grow. And if a poem has enough there to offer, that you will go back, if you're inclined toward poetry, you probably will go back to it. And that's again, when I was mentioning earlier the need to grow, the beauty of growth, that's one of the things I was referring to. It isn't just translations, of course. Poems generally are that way, just to make sure I'm making the point. But I don't really have, that's all I can say without seeing a particular poem and talking with you about it. That's what I would say.
Okay, so I came into this with some Alan Watts running through my head a little bit, and Alan Watts is got me into the whole idea of realizing that words can be a limit because they can't describe everything, and you can't always ascribe words to everything. So when I look at translating our lives into poetry, I focus on that word, translating our lives. And it's interesting to me because the moments that we experience in our lives make me think of the saying, you can't step in the same river twice. And so when it comes to translating those, even if you're translating your own firsthand experience into your own poem, it almost seems like there is that kind of gap, or I don't want to call it a disconnection, but a separation from the actual moment in terms of converting it into words. Now, a quick little story. My family is predominantly Italian, and my grandparents grew up in the East Side, on the East Coast. And they had this interesting thing that they would tell me, is that they understood what their parents, who were native from Italian, they understood what the Italian words meant, but they couldn't speak it. And so they would have instances where their parents would say something to them in Italian, and they look over at their friends who didn't speak the language and just say, she's mad, or something like that. So it makes me, again, think of that word, translating. And my question was, when it comes to translating, when it comes to writing a poem, taking it into account as a performance in and of itself, are you converting feelings and meanings into language, or are you using language to describe meanings and feelings?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, that's an extraordinarily fine question. And it gets at a lot more than, of course, I can say right now. But, to pick up on Alan Watts, he was really into, in the book Cloud Hidden, Whereabouts Unknown, immersion and isolation. Immersion and isolation, that was his pattern. That's my pattern, except modern life gets in the way. But that's really important, I think, in terms of keeping yourself true to when you translate your life into a poem. That pattern, one, in a very literal way, you write, you translate, you do your best in a pass through a poem, you move away, come back to it, immerse yourself in it, again, however many times that needs to happen, usually in my poems, way too many times. And I do tend to work with poems to death sometimes. But that allows you to give, to bring across, do your best, listen to that inner voice, and then move away, come back, and how does that feel to read through? How authentic does it feel? Is that really true to you? Is it really true to the experience, I should say, really, that you're referring to, writing about? And that helps me a lot. But I think both of those things are true. They have to both happen. They happen as partners, really. No, thank you. Yes.
I just wanted to make a comment that that is one of the most useful tools I learned is editing your poems, going back to it. Because when you go back to it, you almost discover feelings and emotions inside of you that you didn't know. When you allow yourself to, you're trying to write a poem about something that happened to you, and going back to it, revisiting it, editing it, it just brings out an emotion that you didn't even know was there, and you're putting it to words, and then you're like, oh yeah, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you don't know where it's going.
I think, speaking for myself, often I don't know where it's going. In fact, it's a requirement. If I knew too much where it's going, it's like, why just say it? Just say it, quote unquote. And so that's discovery that I was talking about earlier. Started off the session, one of the first words I used. That's what I was referring to largely. You discover yourself through the writing of poems and stories, of course, and nonfiction. Essays I've written work kind of the same way, just not as drastically, just not as completely. But yes, absolutely. And then, what you feel here expands.
Yes.
And you get it down on the page and you see it and you absorb it. This expands.
It's like a self-discovery.
And then we'll come back.
Okay.
Yes, it seemed like you emphasized the selective, partial, and provisional aspects of writing poems. Hopefully I don't have to expand on that, but in this going down the rabbit holes, because the rabbit holes have to be explored, and zooming out, zooming in. Can you speak about the bias that we have in each other, or we have inside, and how exploring that bias and then stepping away from it and going back to it? Is there something like that you have in mind?
Bias. Let me reflect on what I'm hearing first, make sure I'm on the right track. We think of ourselves in a certain way. We have these attitudes, skills, beliefs, and all of that. And when we go to write in a sincere way, a poem, for instance, and we discover things we didn't know about ourselves or didn't think about ourselves, we can have the unconscious, or the semi-conscious, probably is a better way to put it, subconscious, where most of our life is. And that wells up through the poem, that inner voice, and we're maybe not comfortable with that, or it maybe reflects well on us, or whatever we feel about that discovery, usually small discovery, how we treat that in a poem, or how we acknowledge, if it ultimately feels authentic, if it sits there if you go in, remove yourself from the poem and come back to it later and read it and go, yep, I guess so. Right? That feels true. Then you're going to leave it. You just live with it. And most of, my thinking is much of our personality, how we shape our personality. I'm a really strong person. I can handle almost anything. I'm speaking as a guy, of course, Women, I've known women who are much stronger than any guy I know.
That's a bias.
It's an observation. It's what I've seen. And something goes against that, you've done yourself a huge favor, for instance, in that situation. If you want to, if you're, an opposite situation might be you have empathy or even sympathy for something that just happened to a friend. A friend has lost someone close to them, for instance. And you have to somehow face the truth that you don't really feel all that bad about it. And you don't want to acknowledge that. Well, it's best to examine that. Why? Find out another truth about the friendship, for instance. How that works in a poem, of course, there's infinite possibilities there. But that, you'd also have to do that in a poem. Where if you were writing I've written, my most recent book, The New Gods, has a poem in there for a friend of mine who lost his son to drugs at age 20. And his son had a brand new son, his wife. And it was awful. And I wrote a poem, and I was, happy with it in the sense that, it did speak to how I feel. And I did feel terrible because I knew young Alex, the son, a little bit. We spent a little time around, and I really liked him. So, but I've had experience in my life where, I don't feel so bad about this. Usually someone who's really awful passing away, something like that. But those, I can't think of a single incident where I felt that way that it made it into a poem, but I might not recognize it. That's another thing. Sometimes we don't recognize what we write. We read it years later, and like we're reading somebody else's poem. I hope that was helpful.
My turn?
Yes.
Quick question. You mentioned at the beginning that at this particular time you're having a difficult time writing. What are you doing to help yourself grow so that you can get back into the feeling of wanting to write?
It was an acknowledgement. First of all, a few months ago, maybe a little longer, that one reason is because my work is changing a lot. It's changing from the voice
That you're used to.
well, it's in The New Gods, for instance, that came out in 2022, end of 2022. And so I'm trying to be patient and see what that new voice, that different voice, what it brings. I've done a few poems recently, but David, who runs our poetry workshop here at Gold Country, he will tell you, I only brought one to workshop. And that's because I need to be able to see the poem first. I don't, the one time you probably shouldn't be doing workshops is when you're undergoing one of these major mutations, call it. You gotta let it happen. Then, take that new stuff and go to workshop. I don't run to a workshop every time me when I've been taking workshops, or in school, UCSB, Fresno State. I finished a poem, run it into workshop. No way. And that's because I have to know more about that poem than I do after I put that last period on the page, or it has punctuation. I have to have some sense of how I feel about it, and I have to have some sense of where I want to take it. And then getting folks' ideas, their thoughts, their helpful criticisms is excellent. It's the best. David.
Bill. David is the even older one. Anyways, we have changed the poetry group so that when you sign up to say you're going to come, you attach your poem. So people can see it for several days before.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking to what you were talking about, it helps a lot.
It does. It does. Yeah, I probably, with some work, wouldn't do that until I, got to the place where, okay, I want to hear about this. I don't want to stop the process before it's time. But that's incredibly helpful, I found. I couldn't make the last workshop, but I read the poems and got in touch with one of the poets. I'm going to say how much I really liked his poem. But yeah, this Gold Country Writers Workshop is really excellent. It's really excellent. I haven't done a workshop in years, and I'm really glad I found it, and we'll see what happens with my time going forward. It could change a lot. Things are happening, but I try not to miss. Whenever I don't have to miss, I don't miss.
Yeah, so I think this works both ways. And so the genius of poets and artists in general is the ability to take an experience, an emotion, and put it into words. Most of us who are not poets, the beauty is I can read those words and it elicits or reminds me of that emotion in my own life in a way that I couldn't have articulated it myself. So you could almost say translating poetry into our lives is the way most of us understand poetry. I hear very concise, and it's different from prose because that's very long, but it's amazing how just a few condensed words can elicit that original emotion, or at least my experience with that emotion.
Well, that's really well put, Camiar. That's really well put. And you've just described exactly what brought me to poetry. That I would read it, and that would happen. And it started in high school. We were studying people like Longfellow and all, and it was, it was interesting. But when I started to read, more modern, less stylized poets, free verse poets, that's exactly what happened, and that's what brought me in. Really well put.
Thank you.
I used to work, still meet with Camiar at least once a month, more often when I can, and he can. And Camiar is excellent editor. He really is. And and eloquent too, as you just
This
heard.
isn't about me.
But at any rate, and he's also, I gotta say it, he's done so much. We met at Department of California Department of Water Resources, and Camiar is huge mover and shaker behind the California Water Plan, a 5-year strategic plan for managing water in the state. And what I always enjoyed about working with Camiar is his knowledge of language. Knowledge of language. You know, I ended up being the lead writer for the plan. And I always felt I had enormous support. I'm sorry, I'm embarrassing you. Enormous support. But this man has done enormous things for water, especially for disadvantaged communities, now frontline communities, those communities facing climate change with fewest resources to adapt. So anyway, thank you for letting me do that, Camiar. You couldn't stop me.
So